Mongolia, 1969. A border patrol officer raises his binoculars across miles of empty steppe. Through the dust, he spots something. A lone stallion, wild mane catching morning light. He blinks. The horse is gone. That was the last confirmed sighting of a wild Przewalski's horse. An entire species vanished. Not with a bang, with a whisper. Most people assumed that was the end. But 30 years later, in a scorching Chinese desert, 27 captive-born horses stood behind a wire gate. None of them had ever seen open land. None of them knew how to find water, avoid wolves, or survive a single night alone. Someone opened the gate anyway. What happened over the next 72 hours made seasoned researchers question everything they thought they knew about these animals. And what's happened since has quietly rewritten the rules of conservation. This is that story. Let's rewind. Before the gate, before the desert, before any of this was possible, there was a math problem. And the math was brutal. By the mid-1960s, Przewalski's horses had been completely wiped out in the wild. Decades of hunting, livestock competition, and harsh winters had done their work. The only survivors lived behind bars in a handful of European zoos. How many? 12. 12 genetically distinct individuals. 5 stallions, 7 mares. That's your entire species right there, fitting comfortably in a single barn. To put that in perspective, your local dog park probably has more genetic diversity on a Tuesday afternoon. These weren't ordinary horses, by the way. Known as taki, Mongolian for spirit, they were shorter, stockier, with stiff, upright manes like a permanent mohawk. Unlike every domestic horse alive, they carried 66 chromosomes instead of 64. They had never been truly tamed. They were the last genuinely wild horses on Earth, and they were almost gone. But in 1959, something rare happened in the world of competitive zoo politics. Institutions actually cooperated. An international stud book was created, essentially a matchmaking database for endangered horses. Breeding pairs were planned across continents. Horses flew on cargo planes between countries. Every foal was tracked, every bloodline mapped. It wasn't glamorous work. It took decades. But by 1980, over 1,000 Przewalski's horses lived in captivity worldwide. Still caged, but no longer doomed. Here's a question nobody talks about enough. You've saved a species in captivity. Now what? You can't just open a door and say, "Good luck out there." These animals had eaten from buckets their entire lives. They'd never seen a predator. Some had never even run at full speed. So China built a boot camp. In 1985, researchers selected a brutal patch of Xinjiang province, the edge of the Jungar Gobi Desert. Summer temperatures hit 42 degrees Celsius. Winters plunged to -30. Annual rainfall barely fills a coffee cup. It wasn't paradise. It was perfect. 24 horses arrived from zoos in the UK, Germany, and the United States, transported on military cargo jets with onboard misting systems to keep them cool during layovers. Once they landed, the real training began. No more hand feeding. Keepers scattered native desert grasses across enclosures, forcing the horses to develop a taste for what they'd actually need to eat. They reduced human contact week by week. And here's a detail I love. They sprinkled wolf droppings around the perimeter fences. No actual wolves, just the smell. Enough to wake up something ancient in these animals' brains, a wariness they hadn't needed for generations, but apparently hadn't forgotten. Meanwhile, geneticists monitored the herd obsessively. Through decades of careful breeding, these horses had retained roughly 95% of their original genetic diversity. For a population descended from just 12 founders, that bordered on miraculous. But genetics alone wouldn't save them. You can have perfect DNA and still die of thirst in a desert. They needed to become wild again. And you can't teach wild. You can only create the conditions for it to return. August 27, 2001. A clear morning over the Kalamaili Nature Reserve. Behind a wire fence, 27 horses stood at the edge of everything they'd never known. 11 mares, 9 stallions, 7 foals, every single one born in captivity. This wasn't the first Przewalski's reintroduction. Mongolia had released horses into the Great Gobi and Hustai National Park starting in 1992 with hard-won success. But China's attempt was different. This desert was harsher, the herd was larger, and nobody was entirely sure it would work. Rangers gently guided them toward the opening. No tranquilizers, no ropes, no safety net. The lead stallion reached the gate and stopped, ears forward, nostrils wide. He stood there for what felt like forever, reading the air for information we couldn't perceive. Then he bolted. The rest followed. 27 horses exploding into open desert, hooves pounding dry earth, dust rising behind them like a curtain closing on their old lives. Within seconds, they disappeared beyond a ridge. And then, silence. For 3 days, nobody could find them. Search teams drove the reserve roads. Nothing. Finally, a rented aircraft picked up faint radio collar signals roughly 60 kilometers from the release point. When rangers reached the herd, they found them gathered around a small spring, a water source that had gone unrecorded on reserve maps. These captive-born animals, who had never navigated anything larger than a paddock, had crossed one of Asia's harshest landscapes and located hidden water in under 72 hours. I want to sit with that for a moment, because it challenges a comfortable assumption that captivity erases wildness. These horses had been behind fences for generations, but something in them still knew how to read a landscape, how to smell moisture and dry air, how to survive. 9 weeks later came another milestone. Rangers observed the first stallion challenge, 2 males squaring off in a ritualized contest that ended not in serious injury, but in a new social order. Dominance hierarchies were forming. Bachelor groups split from family bands. Natural structure was returning on its own. Nobody taught them this. It just came back. For years, the story was simple. Przewalski's horses were the last wild horses. Everything else, every thoroughbred, every Mustang, every pony on Earth descended from domesticated stock. Przewalski's horses were the real thing. Then, in 2018, evolutionary biologist Ludovic Orlando published a study that blew that narrative apart. After analyzing 42 ancient horse genomes, his team concluded that Przewalski's horses were actually descended from horses domesticated by the Botai people of Kazakhstan around 5,500 years ago. They weren't the untouched wild originals. They were ferals, domestic horses that had returned to the wild thousands of years ago. Headlines were predictable. Fake wild horses. Conservation built on a mistake. Some genuinely worried that funding would evaporate. But here's what the headlines missed. These horses had lived wild for over 5,000 years. They evolved different chromosomes. They developed unique gut bacteria specialized for breaking down desert grasses, microbes that barely exist in domestic horses. Their behavior, their physiology, their entire biology had rewilded over millennia. The International Union for Conservation of Nature reviewed the evidence and kept Przewalski's horses on the endangered list. The consensus was clear. What matters isn't where a species came from, it's what it became. And what these horses had become was genuinely, functionally, irreplaceably wild. Success creates new problems. By 2021, the Kalamili herd was growing, but every animal lived in the same desert. One disease outbreak, one catastrophic drought, and decades of work could vanish overnight. China's response was to expand. Multiple sites across different provinces, each with different terrain, different climate, different challenges. The logic was simple. Don't keep your entire species in one place. Inner Mongolia's Dalingshan Reserve received 13 pioneers. Higher elevation, more rainfall, taller grass. GPS data showed these horses needed smaller home ranges than their desert cousins, thanks to richer forage. But winter brought deep snow, so engineers installed barriers to create sheltered feeding areas. Gansu Province's Hechi Corridor came next, ancient Silk Road territory where mineral-rich shrubs could potentially boost mare fertility. A nearby expressway raised concerns about noise disruption, but acoustic monitoring showed the horses adapted quickly. The movement went international, too. Mongolia continued its own reintroductions. Kazakhstan began receiving horses. China started exchanging surplus foals for research data, building a cooperative network that crossed borders and politics. By 2024, China's combined wild and semi-wild populations approached 400 individuals. New sites were being scouted. What had started as a desperate rescue was becoming a genuine recovery. Not a miracle, something better, a repeatable model. I keep coming back to that border officer in 1969, standing on the Mongolian steppe, watching the last wild stallion disappear into dust. He had no way of knowing what would follow. The stud books, the cargo planes, the wolf droppings along fence lines, the desert boot camps, the gates swinging open on a clear August morning. He saw an ending. What actually happened was a pause. From 12 captive ancestors to 400 horses spread across multiple countries. From a species declared extinct in the wild to herds finding hidden water sources, forming natural hierarchies, and teaching their foals to watch for wolves. This story isn't really about horses. It's about whether we believe recovery is possible, for a species, for an ecosystem, for our own relationship with the natural world. The Przewalski's horse doesn't answer that question for us, but it does prove the question is still worth asking. And sometimes, that's enough to open the gate. If this story stayed with you, I'd genuinely appreciate a subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. The science, the struggles, the people behind conservation's biggest gambles. Drop a comment and tell me, what species would you want to see brought back? I'll read every one. See you next time.